Hi everyone, I just finished another correspondence game on chess.com. I had the white pieces, I played d4, and my opponent invited the French defense. So I took him up on it, I played e4, d5, knight c3, and he went for the Winawer variation, very sharp, counter-attacking opening. So he's pinning my knight, which is defending the e4 pawn, so I have to do something about the pawn. And I push it forward, that's the main move. And that gains space in the center, and it takes away that nice f6 square from his knight. And then black wisely strikes at the base of this central pawn chain with c5. Okay, a3 is the main move, and here's where I faced a novelty. Never seen this move, never even thought about it, never crossed my mind before. Queen a5. Just leaving the bishop there. And the point is, if the pawn takes the bishop, then the queen takes the rook. So it's interesting, but ultimately it's not a very good move. The engine says this position is plus 2.5 for white. So not a good novelty. Okay, the normal way of playing here is for black to give up the bishop. Black can also try retreating it to a5, but the main line is to take the knight and give up the bishop pair, and then play something like knight e7 getting ready to castle, and queen to g4 is a thematic move in the Winawer, attacking that weak square on g7. And I have a lot of theory in this opening. If you take a look at my French defense playlist, you'll see several videos in the Winawer. All right, but going back to the game, my opponent tried this queen a5. And I did not respond correctly, unfortunately. After the game was over, I noticed that this move was actually played in one master level game in the Lichess database. And in that master game, the 2600 rated grandmaster played the same move I did, bishop to d2. Okay, and that allows the queen to defend the rook. And so now the bishop really is hanging, and it forces black to take, and white gets a tempo on the queen here. And so black has just wasted time moving his queen out early. So that was my thought process. I did actually temporarily look into the alternative move, which was taking the bishop. And I can't remember why I discarded it. It looked good to me, and it turns out, yes, that's the engine move. That's what I should have played to get a much stronger advantage. The engine says this is simply plus 2.7. Black is wasting time gaining the exchange here while white is getting developed. Not to mention white has this nice knight to b5, attacking the c7 and d6 squares. I looked at the move knight to a6 in my analysis, guarding c7, but white has simply b takes c5, gaining another pawn, and then he's still threatening to put the knight on the d6 square. Play might have continued bishop d7, knight d6 check, king f8, and white is just looking great here. Black has to expend some time to get the queen back into the game. The king is misplaced. These pawns look great, that knight looks great, so white is winning, and the engine says it's plus 3.4. So that's how I should have played, but I think I was much too cautious. Bishop d2, though, does give white an advantage. The engine says it's plus 1.0. And so, as I said, we exchanged here, and the queen retreated. And so white has a lead in development here. And I decided to go for d takes c5 to just immediately relieve myself of having to defend this pawn and to draw his queen maybe to a square where I can attack it. Maybe bishop b4 might come, or bishop d4 at some point. And I can continue to defend the e5 pawn. Okay, and here I played queen g4. A move that is often played in the Winawer, even though I've never seen this particular line before. That square is weak, and it's a little awkward to defend it. The engine actually suggests the best black has is to retreat the queen to f8. But my opponent pushed the pawn forward, which weakens the dark squares on the king side, makes it difficult to castle on that side of the board. And I played knight f3, just getting developed, getting ready to castle king side and supporting that central pawn. Knight c6 is played, bishop d3 developing, getting ready to castle. And I've got a lot of control here of these dark squares. I've got the bishop and the knight pointed here. This queen is doing a nice job along the fourth rank. My pawn is still giving me a lot of space here. And his bishop, as it usually is in the French defense, is pretty bad right there. And black still needs to get castled. So I correctly assumed that I had a strong advantage in this position. Checking it with the engine now, it shows me it's plus 2.5. Okay, bishop d7 was played, so black wants to castle queenside. I castle, he castles. And then I played bishop b4 with the idea that if the queen moves, the bishop can be posted on d6 and maybe restrict that black king there. And I wanted to induce a trade, which my opponent went for, in order to start opening some lines to his king. Now I have the A file. And that pawn, notice, is defended by the queen. So queen b6 was played. And then I tried rook fc1, which apparently is not a great move. I still hold a strong advantage, but it's just too slow. My idea was to open the C file, and I never enacted that plan. So engine says it's probably a better idea to double rooks on the A file by lifting this rook. Rook to C3 here is not much of a threat. The king just steps over and then the black rook can come to the C file. But the idea is to double the rooks here and attack that A7 pawn. For example, if knight E7, the other rook comes to the A file, and A6 really doesn't help because there's a strong sacrifice. Bishop takes A6, B takes A6, rook takes A6, and his king is laid bare. And so white has a winning attack. Okay, so that was a good plan, but I played rook fc1, and then h5 hits my queen. I move it to f4, which attacks f7, and it's awkward to defend that square. My opponent chose to retreat the bishop to defend. And then I decided to double rooks, rook a3. But before I got a chance to double rooks, my opponent blundered here. He wants to develop his knight, and he played it to e7. I notice a lot of my opponents blundering entire pieces in these correspondence games, which seems kind of strange to me when you have all that time in the world. 1,500, 1,600 rated players are blundering full pieces. But I think people are just playing a lot of these correspondence games at the same time, and they're not remembering the games, and they're just looking at it and playing it like it's blitz. So they click on the game, and they get the position up on the screen, and they just make the first move that comes into their minds in some cases. So a lot of players aren't taking these correspondence games as seriously as I am. And that drops a piece to an obvious fork here, queen f6. Okay, forking the rook and the knight. So he saves his rook, and I take the knight. Now he tries bishop to c6, developing the bishop. And I played queen c5, just offering a queen trade. I'm up a piece. I think more forceful, more energetic, and more ambitious is b5, trying to open lines here. But queen c5 is fine. The engine says I'm up plus 6.2. He does trade queens, and then he plays a6. And so now I have to think of a plan of how to get active here. I need a way to break through the position, even though I am a piece up. And so my focus was on this b5 square. And I played knight to d4 to pressure that square. He tried his king up, and then I marched my b pawn forward. So that b pawn is going to break things open. That was my idea, and that's what that knight is doing there to support the advancement of the pawn. He pushes his pawn to f5, which is another blunder, an obvious blunder. That pawn needs protection there. My knight is is on that pawn. So he loses that pawn and a major fork. He moves his king, I take his rook, and the game's over. He resigns. One nice thing about my correspondence game so far is when I got a very large material advantage, my opponents were courteous enough to resign, so I don't have to play for months and months and months in a winning position. I mean, technically my opponent could play a move every 3 days if he wants to and continue to play and make me checkmate him. But I'm glad my opponents have been courteous. That would be a really big pain. One of the downsides of correspondence chess. Okay, I'm going to continue to march up the rating ladder, I hope, and get some better games. I have a couple going right now that are really good. I'm playing against somebody whose blitz rating is like a couple 100 points above mine. So that should be a much better game. But even when you're winning, you can still practice your analysis skills, your visualization skills, and still search for the best moves. And even though this game was pretty easy, I did make a mistake in the opening by not taking his bishop on b4 and allowing him to capture the rook. All right, thanks for watching the video.